So thank you so much, Matthew, for joining us today. I look forward, and our audience look forwards to your insights on exploring Russia's role in the current Iran-Israel conflict. So I'll just begin with my first question. How do you assess and characterize Russia's stance and position in the current Iran-Israel war, the standoff that's going on? Are we seeing a more balancing act, or are we seeing a more overt alignment?
It was interesting. Yesterday, I was actually reading up on some of the statements that President Putin himself was just speaking to this issue yesterday. And a direct quote that I took because I found it interesting and I thought it was very apropos for this question is he mentioned that we are not seeking to mediate, we meaning Russia. We're not seeking to mediate. We are just proposing ideas where if they are attractive to both countries, we'll be happy about it. Now, our proposals are also being discussed. We have contacts with our Iranian friends almost on a daily basis. So let's see. This is so typically Putin when it doesn't pertain to the United States. Like Putin has always loved being seen as a global statesman.
Yeah.
He wants Russia, the Russian Federation, to be taken seriously as a global mediator, as a force for good. I'm into this later, I'm sure, in the discussion. It doesn't matter how much the Americans may scoff at the idea of Russia as a peace negotiator or Russia as a conflict de-escalator. But Putin says these things with no irony at all. Putin believes in these things, and he believes this is what Moscow's natural role should be, especially in the Middle East. He thinks it should be everywhere in the world, but in the Middle East in particular, he has always believed that the Russian Federation has a special place and a special history. So I do think it is attempting to play a balancing role, but the bigger issue to emphasize is that it's not a role that Russia feels is new to it. It's actually a role that Russia thinks is naturally aligned with its interests in the region.
So do you think, I mean, that was the president's statement. Do you think Russia can play the role of a peace broker in the Middle Eastern region in this conflict? Because it's increasingly visible towards Iran, and perhaps its strategic ambiguity towards the Israeli actions.
I actually think it's funny. I can see their balancing act is very difficult to do, but I also see that, and I don't believe people say in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or in the Kremlin. I don't necessarily think the policymakers or the decision makers are stupid. I really don't.
Yeah.
And I think Russia knows that it almost has to be strategically ambiguous because in this particular conflict, because it has relevant interests and relevant alignment with both countries and
Yes.
has had relevant alignment with both countries for a long time.
Yeah.
But it is a very, very delicate knife edge that Russia is trying to balance on, because on the one hand, that earlier desire I just mentioned about wanting to be seen as a relevant player on the global stage in de-escalating major conflicts, it needs that tension, right? It
Yeah.
needs the tension between Israel and Iran for Russia to have that kind of significance.
Yeah.
So it needs to keep them in tension, but also make sure that neither Israel nor Iran go too far, right?
Yeah.
So that there's no dirty bombs or there's no tactical nuclear weapons. That's a very, very dangerous game to play. And I don't think they're dumb in the Kremlin, but I don't know all of them are super, super talented either. So it's a very, very difficult position right now.
So you just seconded what I just said about the strategic ambiguity towards Israeli actions and everything that it's doing. What do you think what's the reason behind that silence or strategic ambiguity of Russia towards the Israeli actions? Is it just its interest, or is it something related to the US also, or maybe about its global image?
I would lean more toward that last part you just mentioned as far as piggybacking on. I think its strategic interests are always the most important thing to Russia. But that global image, Russia is one of the few countries, ironically, I think America is very, very, very strong in this area as well. Russia ties a lot of importance to its strategic interests based on what its global image is.
Yeah.
So sometimes people will actually, a lot of analysts, especially here in the United States, they'll often talk like those two things are separate, distinct objectives.
Yeah.
But Russia sees almost no difference between the position of its global image, or how its global image is being seen, and what its ability to act on its strategic interests are. So it's always very, very important to it what its global interests are and how it ties into its imagery. And that's why I think in this particular case, in this conflict, it has to be ambiguous about it. It has in some ways more immediate direct ties to Iran right now than to Israel.
Yeah.
But it really can't turn its back entirely on Israel.
Yeah.
So that ambiguity that's how it's trying to balance that difficulty, that complexity, that it probably just doesn't exactly know what to do about it just yet. So we'll be strategically ambiguous because we're not really sure how to tame Israel down a little bit. Okay, Israel, you made your point. Okay, you sent a symbolic gesture. Can you back off now, please? Can you stop?
So, every time a standoff like this happens, the countries who have certain things going on in their backyard, theories come out about those things. So some of the analysts, like one of the analysis is that Russia could use this Iran-Israel standoff to leverage it to draw the attention away, the Western attention away from Ukraine. Do you think there's any evidence to support that theory?
What I find interesting about that idea is how I think that's a real thing, but it's playing on the wrong country, right? I don't think Moscow has to use the Israel-Iran escalation or the Israel-Iran conflict to draw Western attention away, because I think Russia has always felt, oh, it's so easy to distract America from one conflict with another conflict if you can make that other conflict more important. And so I actually think that position, or this idea from the analysts that they're tagging onto the Russian Federation, is actually really, it's more of a concern of the United States, that they're worried about, hey, we don't want to forget about Ukraine. We know this new conflict is probably, to be totally honest, a bigger deal to our direct American interests, our strategic security interests, especially in a more critical region of the world to us. But we must not forget Ukraine. And America sometimes in foreign policy is definitely like the cat with the laser pointer. Like it just follows wherever the laser pointer goes. So Russia, I think, is aware, and it knows that, look, I'm sorry, in a competition of like a conflict competition, if we're comparing Russia versus Ukraine against Israel versus Iran in terms of which one of these conflicts is actually truly more important to the more strategic and the more relevant American interests, I'm sorry, Ukraine, but it's actually the Israel-Iran conflict. So there is I think there is a real danger that America will be distracted or forget a little bit, de-emphasize Ukraine. But I'm not sure that's some plan, some magical diplomatic plan that Russia has employed. I think it just tends to be what America does.
So you were just mentioning that Russia has ties with both Iran and Israel, even though it's tilting more towards Iran. How would Russia protect its economic stakes and interest? And how would it, balance this very delicate act and not burn bridge on the either side?
Right. I think the funny thing is, if anything, and I know this is an area in the United States that political economists don't like to talk about, who emphasize foreign policy, is one of the things that is maybe an unintended consequence of what is now perhaps almost a quarter century of various forms of sanctions being leveled against the Russian economy and significant Russian actors, but usually by the United States, but not only, is Russia has almost become, I won't say they're immune to the sanctions, but they have absolutely acquired a new skill set in terms of how to run our country and how to keep going while there are vicious Western sanctions upon us. And in some ways, I will tell you honestly, colleagues here, I'm in DC, in the DC area, they hate when I talk about this, but one of the unintended consequences of all these types of sanctions is it almost pushed Russia faster into the area of, let's try to develop an economic system, a global economic system that is not as dependent on the American dollar or on American influence. And it hasn't completely succeeded in doing that.
Mm.
but it has absolutely started to make new pathways over the last 25 years
Yeah.
that didn't exist before the sanctions. So that's why if people wonder, are sanctions really effective? I think it depends on how we're going to define effectiveness,
True.
right?
True.
Because they have an effect, they have an impact, absolutely. But did they literally shut Russia down?
Mm.
Russia has proven more resilient than that, much to
Yeah.
America's dismay.
So, we've been seeing now in the past very recent days that US has come out very explicitly in its position towards supporting Israeli actions, and Russia is of course edging closer to Iran. So, are we seeing a more Cold War proxy alignment in the Middle East?
I know it's wrong of me to answer a question with a question, but I'm almost prompted when I hear things like that, and I get asked that all the time. I always have to first respond by asking, isn't it kind of true, though, that Russia and America have sort of been doing the Cold War proxy war thing for at least the last dozen years? Like
Yes,
it started long before the Israel-Iran conflict,
that's true.
and it's really been a steadfastness of hawks, right?
Mm.
That term in America, but it's not just American hawks. There are plenty of hawks on the Russian side too.
Yeah.
It's amazing, even though here we are in 2025, it is amazing how many people you can meet in Moscow, in Washington, D.C., who still will almost nostalgically talk about, oh,
The
the
Cold
good
War.
old days of the Cold War when
Yeah.
we knew where everybody stood and what everyone wanted to do, and it was just easier.
Yeah.
And so there's still people, and it's not so much an age thing, right? Like people
Mm.
say, oh, come on, clearly the old Cold Warriors must be gone
Yeah.
now in
Yeah.
Washington, D.C. Well, one, not necessarily. Not all the old Cold Warriors are gone, but perhaps more importantly, those old Cold Warriors. So I'm talking about the people from the 60s and the
Mm.
70s and the early 1980s. They've spent now a generation and a half training the new people who are in DC and in those corridors of power.
Yeah.
So the issue is it's not that we're running around in America with a bunch of 80 and 90-year-old men
Mm.
thinking that it's 1962.
Yeah.
It's that we have a lot of 30 somethings and a lot of 40 somethings and 50 somethings who were taught by those men and women. So
Yes.
they think, even though they weren't born in 1963, we have a lot of young people
But
who
look through
think
that
like
lens.
1963.
Yeah. They have that
Absolutely.
lens on.
And
Yeah.
and there's certainly, and I'm not trying to overly focus on the United States because there are definitely people on the Russian side who think that same way too. Old school Cold Warriors who taught this is the way this is their frame of reference, right? They
Yeah.
liked the world when it was just America versus Russia.
Yeah.
And or at the time Soviet Union, now today Russia. They liked that frame.
Yeah. The
They
bipolar
thought that was
world.
a good frame. Yeah, they thought it was a good frame because they were one of the two.
Yeah.
Like now this I know Russia officially talks all the time about multipolarity and the need for a multipolar world,
Mm.
but it only talks that way because it knows it really can't ever get back to the true bipolar world.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like if we can't be one of the two, then we want six.
Yeah.
Is kind of
So,
the position.
do you think that Russia could use again, not use, but it could just um, take advantage of this crisis in the geopolitical sense in the Middle Eastern region to expand itself and to establish itself as a strong partner, or maybe expand its influence in the region, given that U.S. influence is now increasingly constrained in the Middle Eastern region?
I absolutely. The funny thing, the only nuance I would add to what you just said, because I completely agree with it, is that, and this is an area that is actually, I'm not even sure that it's contested by American analysts. It's just not recognized
Yeah.
very readily by American analysts. Russia has had a very long, stable relationship with the Middle East as a region,
Yeah.
long before the United States got interested in it.
Yeah.
And so I know that Russia would like nothing more than for that to be true, what you just said.
Mm.
But that's based on the idea of, we have a right and useful place of diplomatic influence in the Middle East. We,
Yeah.
meaning the Russian
Yeah.
Federation. And it's not just as a balancing force against American positions.
Yeah.
Sure, of course it does that. But Russia doesn't see the crisis, therefore, as just expanding its leverage as much as it's what it should be doing to leverage and utilize its strategic force, as it always has done in the Middle East for the last 50 years.
Yeah.
So to Russia, the Israel-Iran conflict, that's not a new door opening up for Russia.
Yeah.
To Russia, that's an old door swinging open again.
Yep. Yep.
And Russia thinks it has a right to be a legitimate peace mediator. And that's one of the things. Americans will scoff at that position, but because they'll say, how could you be, for example, a peace mediator about Israel and Iran when look at what you're doing in Ukraine?
Yeah, exactly.
And the Russians will be like, we can name you 10 different instances in the last 30 years where the United States were on one side engaged in a war, and over on the other side, they were actually as a mediator in a conflict.
Yeah.
So Russians have always been very big about, we just want to do what the Americans do.
Yeah.
If the Americans do it and get away with it, we should be able to do it and get away with it.
Yeah.
This drives the Americans absolutely insane. I've talked about this for years, but it never gets, people don't like it any more than they did 15 years ago when I first mentioned it. Don't tell us that the Russians are trying to copy us. I'm like, the Russians are absolutely trying to copy your principles.
Yeah.
And it's like, because the Russians are the ones who say, the Americans like to talk about, well, yes, we're pursuing American interests, but American interests are also aligned with the global good.
Yes.
The Russians have always been, the Russians and the Chinese agree on this, but the Russians are just much more in your face about it. The Russians are like, that's bogus. That's bogus. That your national interests are the global good. No, it's just your national interests. So if you can pursue them, we in Russia can pursue them too.
Yeah.
That's the number one position. So Russia sees that crisis, to your original question. It should expand its geopolitical leverage in the region because Russia feels it's always had a legitimate geopolitical leverage in the region, far longer and far more involved than the United States.
And also a lot more deeper and a rich history with the Middle Eastern region. Yeah.
There's always, you can point it. There's way more. I'm not trying to overplay this or be melodramatic about it, but there is far more diplomatic history between Russia and Middle Eastern countries that the Middle Eastern countries themselves would see as a more fair one-to-one exchange than what many Middle Eastern countries would see as the diplomatic history between themselves and the United States. So, and that's a problem. That's a diplomatic problem that the United States tends to ignore, but it should pay attention to it.
So we were talking about multipolarity right now. So do you think that this whole crisis is sort of accelerating a more like a deeper Russia, Iran, and China axis in the Middle East? Like this realignment?
I think if I can be honest, it's China is the hard part of that equation. I know I've had conversations with people within both countries. I know Russia and Iran both would like nothing more than for that to be true, what you just said. They really want that to be true. But China has basically proven for this entire first quarter of the 21st century that it's not going to be bullied, it's not going to be coerced or cajoled or coaxed into doing any kind of conflict or any type of alignment unless that alignment is fully consolidated with its own long-term planning.
Yes.
And that is actually, Iran doesn't speak to it that much, but Russia has intermittently for the entire regime of Putin, so these 25 years basically, it is intermittently shown its frustration and its irritation because it sees the natural, what you've called that natural axis or that natural alliance should be much stronger than it is. And it knows the only reason that alliance is not more strong is because the Chinese kind of hold back. And the Chinese, I'm sorry, this is very American what I'm about to say, but the Chinese are just sort of using an American business philosophy, which is like, listen, you guys need us way more than we need you. We don't totally not need you. We need you a little bit, but you need us a lot more. So I think we'll call the shots. We, as in China,
you bend to our
will decide. We'll decide how fast this alliance moves and which direction it goes in. We'll listen to you. We'll take your opinions, Russia and Iran, sometimes, but in the end, we'll decide what we're going to do. And so there's sort of some natural breaking. It's not just what can the Americans do to stop it.
Yeah.
It's the bigger break on that development has always been China, not the United States.
So do you like, if it, hypothetically speaking right now, even if it does happen, if it does happen like in a deeper geopolitical sense, like Iran, China, and Russia, they do form an axis, what does that mean for the future of Western hegemony and dominance in the Middle East?
Well, that's a great question. That last little part of it is because I'm always typically the person who likes to like sort of calm American panic down because they'll be like, it'll be the end of the world if Russia, China, and Iran really actually get together and are great friends, and it's a real axis. And I'm like, I don't know if it's really going to be the end of the world. But that last part of your question, when you're saying how might that impact Western hegemony in the Middle East,
Yeah.
I think that access could be very, very impactful and very detrimental to Western hegemony, without doubt. I mean, I think it would be the end of Western hegemony in the Middle East.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it wouldn't. It doesn't mean it's the end of Western influence, but it would be the end of Western hegemony.
Yeah.
And those are, slightly different things. And that would just be because China's One Belt, One Road initiative factors so heavily throughout the region of the Middle East. It needs the Middle East. It needs a stable, peaceful Middle East for the One Belt, One Road to truly work. Because when you actually see the way that project, I know maybe some of our readers and listeners don't know what that is, but it basically, the Middle East part of the One Belt, One Road project is the core of three pieces. If three pieces are sort of the South Asian end, and the end piece is the Western European end, the middle piece that connects them is the Middle East part. So it's very, very important that the Middle East stays. That's why most of the Chinese comments so far during the Israel-Iran conflict has been, it's almost been it's sort of like funny. It's like the parent who's talking to teenagers being like, we get it. You guys are upset with each other, but you both know you're eventually going to have to stop fighting and you're going to have to talk. You do understand this, right? Like, that's literally all China keeps saying is like, you guys know you have to negotiate. It's going to come down to that. So why don't you just stop throwing these missiles at each other and get to the table
and sit down and
it's funny to see China as the the elderly parent saying, now get to the table and eat your vegetables. Israel, Iran.
That's very true. That's a very nice and vivid picture you painted in my mind, which also explains the situation very well. So you've answered all my questions very smartly, fast, and succinctly. It brings me to my last question. Like, if this conflict persists and escalates, what would compel Russia to intervene in this, according to its interests, based on its interest? Not to just.
The funny thing is, I think Russia has a couple of different. One has some strategic interests where it's almost always going to mirror. It's always going to mirror image America in this conflict, I think. So, and I don't think because of the presence right now of President Donald Trump, there's no chance at all we'll ever have American boots on the ground in that region for that conflict. So as long as there's no Americans there, there'll be no Russians there. They'll just mirror image each other. Russians love doing that anyway. They think that's part of the game, and they fascinate themselves with that. But it also, I think Russia has limitations that it maybe didn't have 5 years ago, right? There's a certain expenditure of both resources and material in another place called Ukraine that would make it, I think if Russia remembers its own history, it should avoid two front wars or conducting two wars at the same time. It doesn't have the best success record when it does things like that. Nobody does, to be honest, but Russia in particular has a very bad record on this. So I think it's aware of that. So I'm not sure that Russia will ever escalate in the region in a physical military way, not in terms of Russian soldiers. I'm sure it could become more involved from providing resources or providing expertise, things like that. But again, we fall back to some of our earlier questions that you and I have spoken about, is it has interest with both countries, and I don't think it wants to separate that out.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think it wants to pick one
It cannot.
and
I
let
don't
the
think
and let
that's
the
even
other one.
possible. I don't think that's even possible
Right.
to just take one very solid stance and just, turn its back on the other rival.
Right.
Or
Russia, interestingly enough, is the one country, the one major power in the world today that really can't do that. Like America obviously can. America will not help Iran. America will always help Israel.
I
It
don't think
might.
even
Donald
China
Trump is
can
at
do that
least.
because China has economic interest with both. With Iran, it has energy, and with Israel, it has technology. So even China cannot pick a side, even
I
if
think
it's
that's
given
true.
the yeah.
I would be, if push came to shove, this is just me as a betting man. I think China would, if it absolutely had to, would ultimately choose Iran
Yeah,
because how much energy is so much more important to it than technology from one
yeah,
particular state.
yeah,
Uh, but I agree with you that I don't. It doesn't want to.
yeah,
It doesn't want to, and it wants this thing to end because it's. I think China is also the one that has sort of said, both of you are probably not sending soldiers in either direction. You're just gonna, if all you're gonna do is just throw missiles at each other, this isn't even a war.
yeah,
Like, China's like, our understanding of war is not you just throw missiles at each other for a couple weeks and then you just stop because you've run out of each side has run out of missiles. Like, that's not a war. So they're like, so again, get to the table.
yeah,
Get to the table because neither one of you are going to win.
yeah.
Right? Like, neither one of you are going to win. Like, oh, the other side's completely defeated. We accomplished every objective we
Exactly,
wanted to
exactly.
accomplish, so we can stop.
That
That's
sort
not
of
going to
an
happen.
end, yeah, that sort of an end is this conflict is not going to see. Like one side surrenders and the other side, just claims like it conquers and it claims the win, like we've conquered. That's not the sort of conflict we're looking at. So yeah,
I've gotten into arguments here in the States about this because I honestly believe modern warfare today is such that I don't know if we'll ever have that kind of conflict ever again.
yeah,
Because even if it's a traditional war, starts off as a traditional conflict, if one side really did come close to being totally defeated, I
yeah,
think they would fall back to guerrilla warfare and terrorist attacks. So they
yeah,
could keep the conflict going.
yeah,
They could keep it going where they could argue, I didn't quit.
yeah.
I didn't quit. I just had
Just
to
found new
change our
ways
tactic.
to yeah, just found new ways
Right.
to participate. So is there
We just had
any
to change
that
our
that
tactic.
brings me back to the end of my questions. Is there anything else that you want to share with us? Any insider analysis? The it
Hmm.
like half an hour just passed in a blink of an eye. That was like so quick because I was enjoying the conversation so much that I didn't even look at
Good.
the clock.
We'll have to continue it again. With that, there'll always be more with
Absolutely,
modern diplomacy.
absolutely.
There's always more issues.
Yeah, that's true.
I think it's interesting, and I don't know if this is happening, say, in Western Europe or in India or in China, but it's been interesting to me here in the last week. We've noticed all across social media, various different streaming platforms.
Hmm.
Israel has actually been airing what it can't be called anything else other than basically pro-war propaganda.
Okay.
And I don't even mean that negatively. I just mean that Israel is trying to communicate its message to the American people
Yeah.
by invading YouTube videos and
Yeah.
TikTok videos. It's a really new way of approaching how to do it's almost like TikTok diplomacy in a
Yeah.
way. They're like,
Exactly.
we don't want the Americans to lose
Side of
alignment with
yeah,
why
to
we're
lose sight
doing
of
what we're doing.
even though in the polls it was shown that the Americans are not really the Americans, meaning the public, is not really invested in this war because they're saying it's not our war. Why should our country go to war with Iran? And to add to what you said,
Well, and
I
some
saw
people, that's what I mean.
yeah, to what you said, I saw it on Instagram. It was a picture of one of the billboards in Israel saying it was President Trump's picture, and it was written, "Mr. President, finish the job."
Yeah.
That
Well, and look,
that's
and if you have any
interesting.
doubt how important it is, there's these. It's a very slickly done. These are very slickly done videos, very
Yeah,
professionally done, and it's very, very patriotic, very informative. But the narrator, the person who's doing the voiceover for the video,
yeah.
it's it's Benjamin Netanyahu.
Oh wow,
It's Netanyahu himself
himself.
talking about Operation Rising Lion, and this is important. It is important. We are taking we're basically saying we're taking the hit
Yeah.
for Western civilization.
Yeah.
Like we're taking the risk for
For
Western
preserving
civilization.
the
So
ideals,
they're
Western
trying to
ideals.
remind America, yeah, they're trying to remind America that you don't have to do this because we're doing it for you.
Yeah.
So that the least you can do is keep supporting us.
Yeah.
That's if that's successful. The only reason I bring this up is because it's a new thing that has only just started happening in the United States within the last week.
Yeah.
But if that's successful, then the United States will keep supporting Israel. And as long as that happens, as we've seen in Ukraine,
Yeah.
as long as Ukraine keeps having the American military resources,
Yeah.
it can keep fighting. It can't win,
But
but it can keep
it'll
fighting.
be in the game at least.
It can
Yeah.
just keep fighting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Matthew. That was a blast of a conversation. I enjoyed myself thoroughly. Well, I know that you have such amazing and interesting perspectives now. I'll keep you in the loop whenever something comes up.
Thank you.
Whenever a similar conversation comes up, you'll be the first one to be contacted. I shall share the
Thank you
link
so
as
much.
soon as
Anytime.
this interview is published. I'll email you the links of both print as well as YouTube video. Thank you so
Awesome.
much. I had an
I
amazing
appreciate it.
time. You have a good
Awesome.
day ahead.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.